Hey guys, we're back with part 2 of this tutorial, and now we're gonna start working on her tail. Again, for her tail we're using more bluish greenish colors, of course, and I'm gonna use mostly my hard edge round brush. And especially for this particular surface, I do want to have that texture, that more of a brush stroke like texture, because that will help translate better that sort of surface, and because I'm not gonna, paint or draw scale by scale, because I will go mad doing that and it's not necessary. You still want to find a way to translate that in a way. And like I mentioned, I enjoy doing this so much. It's like my favorite part. Now I want to paint a bunch of tails. Probably I won't, but I would like to. Just mermaids have always been one of my favorite creatures, even though I don't paint them as much. I do love them. And there's something about these sort of colors that I really enjoy so much. I will say in general, I enjoy this sort of color scheme way more than a more colorful one, even though I do love those. For some reason, I am naturally drawn more to this type of colors. Also, for the tail, I am incorporating a bit of a different brush that you can also find in my brushes essential pack, and is one that is a bit more square like in shape, and it has a bit of a stronger brush stroke, if that makes any sense. So that helped as well to build that texture that I wanted from the tail. And again, with a surface like that, you will have, your base, and then you will have some high values in the shine of the scales. And you also want to have like a good transitions from the tail up to the torso, so it's not gonna be a completely harsh line between skin tone and fishtail color. So you want to have a bit of that transition. And again, a lot of mixing, a lot of building layers, adding some brush stroke, and then picking up that resulting color and then blending with that one. And that is always my general rendering technique, if you want to say it that way. Also, I always paint directly from color from the beginning. I never liked to start with black and white and then add color. Probably if I will take the time to really practice it, I will get to a point where I will like the result that I can get, but I haven't. And in general, I just really enjoy starting with color from the beginning. And I think that also comes from me thinking about it almost as if we're traditional painting. Another thing is that I try to achieve my main result with just painting, with just the basic, not having to use a lot of overlay or multiply or things like that. And I'm not saying that that's wrong or bad. Some people do that and they do amazing work, but just personally, I think I am more traditional at heart. And even though I do use those different layers for adjustments, I try to always keep it very subtle and minimal, I try to achieve again the main results with just painting. But again, as a general advice, I will say it still is good to play around and practice with what I just said that I didn't use, because you might never know. You might find a way to do things that you really love, and if you never try it, how would you know? So now, so I have the main base for my tail, at least on the front part, mostly done. Now I'm gonna work a bit on the end of the tail and doing, pretty much the same. Also here I'm adding a part that I was missing right there. I thought for a moment I wanted to have that same element on the front part of the tail as well, but then I changed my mind and scrap it. And also, the way I'm thinking about for this piece is my main focus is hair, of course, and that's where I'm gonna have the most detail and fine work, and everything from there, going backwards to the background will be less refined, because one, that will help it give that more atmosphere like distance, the things that are farther away, you won't have as much of a focus as the things that you have right in front of you. And also because that will also help to bring focus to the areas that I want. My main focus is her, so that's where I'm going to keep my most detailed and refined work, and the rest I need it to read well and to work, but I don't need it to have that much detail. Here, as you can see, I'm just working on the back of the tail. And like I mentioned, with me changing the first initial shape that I had for the end of the tail, I think the way that I have it now, for example, gives it more movement to the piece, instead of having that straight horizontal line that will almost cut in half my painting. The way that it is now, it helps you navigate through it better, and it doesn't cut it in half in a way. And I think it also gives a bit of a feel like she's about to move it, to move her tail, and that also gives a more dynamic feel to it. For the tail, I'm gonna do, very loosely. Again, in that part, I don't need a lot of refined detail. Always be checking constantly on your navigator to see if it reads well, because sometimes you might think that you need to add way more than you actually need for it to read perfectly fine. And especially when you're looking at the painting, like this zoomed out as a whole, there's a lot of times where some elements you might need way less refined rendering, and it will still look like it has, and it reads well, so be aware of that. And sometimes in those areas, if you overdo it, it might end up looking not as best as if we're doing it the other way. Okay, here I'm gonna adjust that lock of hair that I felt like it was sticking out too much. So I just selected and, changed the size of it. And now I'm gonna start working on the horns, and this was another one of the parts what I really enjoyed. I didn't know, but I really love painting horns. It's one of those things I remember once when I was working for, doing art for a board game and I had to paint a lot of camels. I realized I really love painting camels. I would have never known if I didn't have to paint those, but you never know. That's why it's always good to try different things. For this, I am gonna use mostly that same brush that I mentioned you guys that I use for a bit of the tail, and I think I'm gonna give you guys that brush separately so that you can find it easily. And we're gonna call it I feel like call it horn brush. Look, sounds kind of terrible, but you know what I mean. So I'm gonna give you that brush in a separated file so you can find it easily, but I'm gonna mainly use that one. And again, for this I searched for some reference of some goats and different horns to have an idea of how to translate that. And now I'm starting with defining roughly the main shape of it. So this horn is in a way divided in two zones, and now I'm adding the part that is going to be covered more in shadow. This felt really calming painting this. It's like when I have to paint a lot of hair and it feels so calming. I don't know. It's really fun. Usually I will get really nervous painting something that is like this, something that has to have a lot of random shapes that are similar but not exactly the same. But this way I felt pretty good about it. So now I'm just defining edges. And again, sort of keeping in mind my overall color scheme. And I did wanted to leave all of these parts in and not over speed it, because you might never know, one of you guys might really find this helpful. So here it is. Sometimes I will look at a painting and feel like, man, I would really like to see how that person did that. So here I really wanted to show you every little part of it. And also, when I added my base colors for the horns, as you can see, I already put there in a way my highlights and shadows. So working and building from there up to the most detail is not as difficult, because in a way I already have there, the color that I need. I just need to add that more refined detail. If I were to build that highlight, for example, from a very dark color, it will take me way longer, it will be more difficult. As you can see here, guys, I'm gonna incorporate a bit of color variation. The areas that are more covered in shadow, I'm gonna have a more blue tone to them, and the one that is more highlighted is gonna have a bit more of a yellow or warm tone. And again, it's very subtle, but I think it looks visually interesting. I'm always been a sucker for just values, to contrasting values. I love black and white paintings, and I love painting in black and white. There's something about it that, I don't know, I'm just drawn to it. Some people do amazing paintings and they really don't resort to that at all, but me personally, I just enjoy it so much that I cannot help to use it always. Here, also making sure that that horn incorporates well with the rest of the skin, and it doesn't look just like it's sticking out without no connection to the skin. Later, also, we're gonna have a bit of a hair covering it, overlapping, because that always helps to make something feel like it's, a part of the same body of volume, and it is not like just floating, separating from one another. The same thing as, for example, if you have anything overlapping something else, have in mind that doesn't need to cast a shadow, for example, anything like that. But using that resource always helps to bring things together. And as you can see now, I'm working on a more, small detail. Again, nothing too crazy. As long as it reads well, that's gonna be the point where I'm gonna be, saying, okay, that's good, but still adding that more detail. And as you can see, also I incorporated a bit of color variation on the highlight area as well, very subtle. I'm gonna incorporate some marks, maybe, from, I don't know from what, but some marks from there. I think it gives it a bit more interest to the area, can give a bit more of a story. With any element, any detail that you can think of, for example, that bit of a mark on the horn, that it can be from a hit of another horn or something, I don't know, a sword or anything like that. It sort of gives the element a bit of lived in feel. The same with clothing, for example. If you're painting a character and you can incorporate a bit of stain to the clothing, if it is a character that has been walking around in the woods, then you might have some tearing in, some part, or a bit of mud on the lower part of the body or anything like that. All of those little elements give more life to a character. The same way I feel about adding some moles or freckles to the skin, all of that. Now I'm adding my final highlight to the horn. Yeah, I really enjoy painting this. I just really enjoy tiny detail. Even though that makes me take so much longer to do any piece, but I love it, so I cannot help it. And again, if you want maybe a more painterly look, you won't need as much of a small detail as this. You can simplify it way more, but in general, and especially for this piece, I did want it to go that way. And even though it is a lot, it still is not like 100% refined. If you zoomed in, you pretty much see that it's a lot of looser brush strokes and nothing too defined. But when you zoomed out, it reads as if it were. And now I'm just gonna add a bit more work to the horn that's on the back. You know, I've always been just terrified, not terrified, but I hate painting mountains. It's not like I have painting tons, but I just really don't look forward to it. But now that I'm thinking, I could totally use the same sort of way that I did the horns to do mountains. I don't know why. Like I mentioned, whenever I have to paint something that is a lot of random shapes that repeat themselves but has to be slightly different, I just get so nervous about it, so I should paint more of that. They're adding, some very small adjustments here and there. And especially as you progress in your painting and you finish more elements, you might see some areas that you need to go back and adjust something. There, for example, I realized I need to bring a bit more of a lighter value right there in that area. Especially, for example, if I'm gonna have a certain value on the tail that is on the same sort of level that the elbow, that needs to match. So I cannot have a super dark elbow in or forearm in the shadows if something that is right next to it has a strong higher value, if that makes any sense. Again, I apologize because my pug is snoring right next to me, so I'm sorry about that. And now that I have pretty much said what I need in the body, I'm gonna move to work a bit on the background. And there it's not gonna be final, but I just wanted to map out that I wanted to have Saturn there in the distance, because if you don't know, Saturn is the ruling planet of Capricorn, and this piece is a Capricorn inspired piece, of course. There I just darkened slightly the background a bit in that transition. Now I'm gonna add a bit more highlight what I saw needed in the tail. Again, until the very end, nothing is really done. I do need to adjust elements as I move forward in the painting, because sometimes when you add, for example, the background, you need to adjust some things in the character, to make it look good. Again, I'm just doing small adjustments. For the background, also, keeping again in mind my overall color scheme. Here I'm gonna add, my highlight to the fish tail. It's not really fish, but to the tail. And I'm using that brush that I mentioned to you guys, the same that I use for the horns. And at first I just added some crazy brush strokes, and now I'm gonna go in and clean them, and shape them better with the eraser. Usually when I do this kind of stuff, I use the same brush that I used to add the highlights. I use that same brush to erase and to get the shape that I want. Again, try to not overthink it. It doesn't have to be completely perfect, as long as it reads, well. Have in mind also that we're painting an area that has scales, so it's not a completely smooth surface. Here I also use one of my brushes that you can find in my pack as well, to give it a bit more texture. But after this I will use a photo texture, because I wanted to give it that scale look to it. But again, I was not gonna paint scale by scale, that will drive me crazy. So in situations like this, you can totally do that. Again, don't overuse it, make it subtle, and try to make sure that it blends well with the rest of the image, so it doesn't look, everything looks sort of, like an illustration, and then suddenly an area, it looks like a photo. That will really look off, so you need to adjust it to make it fit. But at this point I'm still only just using my brushes. And even though I will use a photo texture, like I mentioned, I do want to make it subtle, so I need to have a good base, and a good base that already have the values and the highlights and colors that I want. And I could have even just leave it the way it is, and I think it would have worked too, but I wanted to take that extra step. Here, before I use, again, the photo texture, I'm just gonna work a bit more on the tail, adjust my values, as I see needed. Here I had two options and I ended up going with this one. I set this to overlay, you know, the layer, I set it to overlay, and I didn't use 100% opacity. I also adjusted slightly the levels of the image. Also, I went in and applied filter, noise, and medium, and what that will do will take slightly off that super sharp look of a picture, you know, again, to make it work better with the painting. And when you use the filter, you know, noise, medium, use a very low percentage, like 3%, no more. Here then I adjusted, you know, a bit the opacity of the layer, and what I did, I masked it completely, so I completely, you know, removed it, and then I'm gonna go to that mask and let it show through only in the areas that I need. And the way you do that is, as you can see in the mask, the areas that are covered in black are the areas that you will not see on the image, and if you paint with black on top of that, you are gonna make those areas show through. And there I also copied the scale layer to add it to the rest of the tail as well, and doing the same, masking it and then letting it show through. There I also adjusted slightly the shape to make it fit better that curvature of the tail, and then adjusting that mask to let it show through. And again, as you can see, the texture that I use for the tail is not 100% in every single area, only in the areas that I needed to show, especially around the highlight areas. Again, to make it be subtle, we don't want it to look all of a sudden like a random photo there. Now I'm gonna move to the hand. I really like, you know what, I really love painting this entire piece overall, because I really enjoyed doing that hand, even though it was in a bit of a weird position and it had a lot of, you know, wrinkles forming, and that was really fun. Again, when you're doing something that is it is in a more complicated position, the same as with the elbow, for example, just don't overthink it. Try to just think about it in just basic shapes and forms, and you know, where you have light and where you have shadow, and translate that. You don't need to go crazy with detail as long as it reads well. Don't work it too zoomed either, you know, and it'll be fine. Okay, here I thought I could add some shine, you know, from being wet type of things, but then realized it looked really bad and totally regretted that. So just, by the way, I'm doing this on a different layer. Whenever I'm gonna add something that I'm not 100% sure I will keep or it will look right, I do it in a different layer, so in that I can just delete it if needed, like on this case. Here, then I'm just adding some tiny touches to the tail, some more moles here and there. Again, very just small, tiny adjustments here and there as I see needed. Also here I'm gonna add a bit of color variation to the skin. It's very subtle just to make it a bit more cool tone on the highlights. And I'm also adding a bit more blush to the cheeks, and then I'm gonna move to the background before I do the hair, because I knew the hair was gonna be easy and sort of fast, but I was worried about the background. I was a bit like, how am I gonna do this? And whenever I'm gonna do something and I know it's gonna be, more challenging, I start to procrastinate. But this time when I realized I was gonna start doing that, I was like, you know what? No, use that time better to just do it instead of just avoid it, and you're gonna save time. So again, I started with sort of my base that very roughly is setting my color and light and shadow, and then the way I went for it is I was gonna use the selection tool to map out the main areas that's gonna be lighter, to differentiate from the areas that need to have shadow. And I did this with the lasso tool because I realized that's gonna be quicker than if I try to do the same with just a brush. But of course later we're gonna work on it so it doesn't look just like that, because that will look really bad. But to start, I did that. I did have reference of beaches and sand and all of that, because I would have had no idea how to do that from imagination. So what I was looking for is to have the look of wet sand, and also having in mind that it needs to work with her being positioned right there. And also thinking where I want more darker areas or lighter, how it's gonna work with my values. And again, just very roughly adding shapes with the lasso tool, and always having a look on my navigator, because even if now looks kind of terrible more zoomed in, if you start reading well on the navigator, I know I'm going on a good path. There, that area right there is where I'm gonna have water coming in on the shore, and again very roughly mapping out the main silhouettes. And at this point I was totally thinking, I have no idea how I'm gonna do this, it's gonna look terrible, but I'm just gonna go for it. In the end it ended up being just fine. Then I went on top of it with the soft edge round brush to soften any area needed. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my brush using the mixing brush tool option. So if you click right on top of your brush icon, you'll have several options that you can choose from, and this is the last one. So I'm gonna grab that one and I'm gonna start soften the selection that I did. All of this is on the same layer, because if you have it on separate layers, it won't work the same way. So all of this is just in one layer, and using that mixer brush, I'm gonna start soften everything up, and that really helped to bring that more, sand texture that I was looking for. Of course, you can play around and adjust the setting of that mixer tool brush to make it work for you, and that is not too harsh or too soft. And once I start doing this, I start feeling way better and feel like, okay, I found a way to make it work. And also incorporating a bit of brush strokes with the soft edge round brush where needed, and really start building, things up. I wanted to have more of a foggy background, so I'm incorporating that as well. And of course I need to go and, refine everything more, but at this point at least I knew I have a good base. And even at this point you can already start reading what was there, as a beach, as sand. So now I'm gonna add a bit of shadow, especially where she's placed. And I think I'm doing this with my multitask brush. A bit of a mixture of that one and just the basic round ones. And at first I was making such a big fuss about I don't know how to do it, and it ended up being way more simple than I thought. I just needed to get to it and not try to avoid it. Again, here I'm, sort of helping blending better and soften some areas with the basic round brush. And again, refining everything better. Here I'm gonna add more highlight, where needed, close to her body. Of course, having in mind that she's, placed on top of sand, and that is, of course, altering that area. And I need to make sure it looks that way, and it doesn't look like she's just floating on top of, the floor. Here also I'm gonna play around a bit with some adjustments for hair, some levels to adjust values, some color balance or selective color. With selective color, for example, you can just select all the reds in your image and adjust just that, so that can be very useful. And here I'm gonna add some rocks in the background. Again, I didn't want it to overthink it. I just grabbed my lasso tool and went for it. And of course, then on top, I went in with my brush and work a bit on it, because I will never want to leave something in my painting just made with lasso tool, because that would look way too harsh. I needed to soften that up slightly. So I'm gonna go in with my brush and help that, but at least that helps me to get the main shape really quick. And at this point I just did it with whatever color. I'm gonna change that later. Also I'm gonna the rocks that are more closer to the front are gonna be in a different layer than the ones that are gonna be more on the back. And this part is gonna end here, so I'm gonna see you in the last one, guys. Bye.